The rain had been falling on Edinburgh for 3 days straight when William Burke first walked down Tanner's Close. November 1827 brought the kind of cold that seeped through worn coats and settled deep in the bones. Burke was 37 years old, Irish-born, with calloused hands and empty pockets. He had come to Scotland's capital following rumors of work, following hope, following the same desperate dreams that drew thousands of Irish labourers across the sea each year. The West Port district was a world away from Edinburgh's grand Georgian squares. Here, narrow closes and cramped winds twisted between buildings that leaned together like conspirators. The smell hit Burke immediately. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, human waste. He'd known poverty before, but Edinburgh's slums possessed a particular wretchedness that shocked even him. Everything he owned fit in a canvas bundle over his shoulder. 2 threadbare shirts, patched trousers, his father's razor. That was the sum of William Burke's possessions as he pushed open the door of Hare's lodging house. The interior was dark despite the afternoon hour. The ceiling hung so low that Burke could almost touch it. Unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and boiled cabbage created an atmosphere thick enough to taste. A dozen people lived in those cramped rooms, sleeping on straw mattresses laid directly on the floor. William Hare stood behind a crude wooden counter, a stocky man with shrewd eyes that immediately assessed Burke's worth. He was Irish, too, from County Armagh, though he'd been in Edinburgh longer. He'd acquired this miserable property through marriage to Margaret Laird, widow of his former employer. Margaret herself sat in the corner counting coins with the concentration of someone for whom every penny was survival. 4 pence for a bed, no breakfast. Burke paid and was shown to a communal room where other lodgers lay in various states of consciousness. One old man coughed violently in the corner, a wet, rattling sound of lungs giving up. Another sat staring at nothing, eyes empty of hope. Burke lay on his straw mattress and stared at water-stained ceiling boards. Rats scratched in the walls. This was rock bottom. The following weeks established a grim routine. Each morning, Burke searched for work, docks, construction sites, anywhere needing manual labor. But Edinburgh had more laborers than jobs, especially for Irish immigrants facing both poverty and prejudice. Most days he returned with nothing but sore feet and growing hunger. The lodgers became familiar faces, society's forgotten people, elderly pensioners on pittances, casual laborers between jobs, women too old or sick for prostitution, drunks beyond caring. They passed through Hare's establishment in constant flow, interchangeable in their misery. Hare watched these lodgers with calculating eyes, keeping mental records of debts and payments. Margaret was sharper still, quick to throw out anyone who couldn't pay. It was hard-scrabble business with thin margins, run with the ruthless efficiency poverty demands. Old Donald had been there longest, perhaps 70 years old, a former soldier surviving on a meager military pension that barely covered rent. Burke had spoken with him briefly about Ireland, about wars, about better days. The old man's cough worsened daily, his body failing in that slow, undignified way that accompanies poor old age. When Donald died in his sleep on a cold December night, it surprised no one. Death visited places like Hare's regularly. Margaret discovered the body at dawn and informed her husband with the emotional investment of reporting a broken window. Hare's reaction was pure frustration. The old soldier had died owing £4, money they'd never see. Worse, burial would cost more. Burke stood in the doorway watching this conversation. Donald looked peaceful at least. His suffering had ended. There were worse deaths than sleep. Hare paced, calculating the loss. £4 represented weeks of rent from multiple lodgers, money desperately needed, and now more expense disposing of the corpse. In that moment of frustration, opportunity arrived. Burke saw the change in Hare's expression. Sudden stillness, a calculating look he would come to know well. Everyone in Edinburgh had heard stories about the medical schools and their constant need for cadavers. Surgeons, led by the famous Dr. Robert Knox, required steady supplies of fresh bodies for anatomical teaching. The legal supply, executed criminals, was woefully inadequate. This created a market. Resurrection men, they were called. Grave robbers who sold fresh corpses to anatomists. But here was a body requiring no grave robbing. Donald had died with no family, no friends, no one to ask questions. Who would know if his body reached an anatomy table instead of a pauper's grave? When Hare voiced the suggestion, something shifted in the room. Burke felt a moral line that had seemed solid suddenly reveal itself as permeable. He looked at Donald and saw not a man he'd known, however slightly, but a commodity. 7 pounds, Hare estimated. Margaret worried about legal consequences initially, but as Hare explained the economics, 7 pounds for a body that would otherwise cost them money, her objections faded. The Hares hadn't survived poverty through squeamishness. This was business. Burke nodded along, contributed suggestions, became complicit through participation. Donald wouldn't know the difference. Medical science needed bodies. The rationalizations came easily. That night they wrapped Donald in a sack and carried him through dark Edinburgh streets to Surgeons Square. The city quieted after dark, but never truly slept. Night watchmen looked away. Prostitutes saw everything, said nothing. Drunks noticed nothing at all. Dr. Robert Knox's anatomy theater occupied an imposing building near the university. Knox himself was controversial, brilliant, arrogant, blind in one eye from smallpox, possessed of ambition that made him overlook certain questions about specimen origins. When Burke and Hare carried their sack into his dissecting room, he examined the contents with professional detachment. He asked perfunctory questions, time of death, cause, but these were formalities. Knox didn't truly want details. What mattered was freshness, suitability for dissection. Donald, dead just hours, was perfect. The doctor paid 7 pounds 10 shillings without haggling, more money than Burke had seen in months. As Knox counted coins, he mentioned casually that he was always in need of fresh subjects. The legal supply was insufficient. If they came across other unclaimed bodies, he'd be interested. No questions asked. Prompt payment. Burke and Hare left with heavy purses and lighter consciences. They went directly to a pub and ordered good whiskey, not their usual rot gut. In the warm glow, dividing the money, neither spoke what both were thinking. One body, 7 pounds 10. Knox wanted more. Edinburgh was full of people nobody would miss. People died daily from disease, exposure, malnutrition, drink. What if those deaths could be expedited? The thought was monstrous. Both knew it. But poverty makes the monstrous seem practical. They'd already crossed one line selling Donald. The next line, though darker, seemed less distant than it should. Burke walked back alone, money secure in his pocket. The streets were full of invisible people. An elderly drunk in a doorway, a sick beggar on a corner, a desperate prostitute past her prime. Society had already condemned them through indifference. These were the thoughts of a man compromising with evil. But the coin's weight, the promise of escaping poverty, made those thoughts seductive. Burke had spent years ground down by want, by hunger, by society's casual cruelty. Now he'd found a way to profit from that same indifference. On his straw mattress that night, Burke didn't sleep. He felt himself changing, felt whatever decency he'd possessed beginning to erode. He told himself this was one time, that he'd take his share and find honest work. But he knew it was a lie. He'd seen the look in Hare's eyes, recognized it in himself. They'd discovered something valuable, a business in death itself. And in 1827, Edinburgh, death was everywhere. Down the hall, Hare and Margaret counted their share. The money represented months of lodging-house income. Margaret, ever practical, could see the possibilities. Hare was already planning. They would need Burke. The work required 2 men, and Burke had proven capable and willing. They would need care, discretion. They would need to choose wisely. people whose disappearance wouldn't cause alarm. The word victims came unbidden to Hare's mind, not waiting for death but creating it. The difference between grave robbers and what he contemplated was the difference between theft and murder. But the money argued louder than conscience. Margaret's calculating silence showed she'd made her accommodation, and Burke, he sensed, was ready to follow this dark path. Outside, Edinburgh slept restlessly. In Newtown's grand houses, doctors and students studied anatomy texts, frustrated by cadaver shortages. In Old Town slums, the poor fought for survival, expecting no mercy. Between these worlds, an opportunity existed, dark, terrible, and irresistible to men with nothing to lose. William Burke closed his eyes. In his mind, he was already counting, already selecting, already planning what he told himself was somehow different because it served science. That's how it begins. With a compromise, a rationalization, a small step across a line that makes the next step easier. Burke had become a murderer in his heart. The actual killing would follow as inevitably as dawn. Morning would bring their true partnership. They would hunt for subjects, for bodies. They would become what Edinburgh feared in whispers. Not grave robbers, but something far worse. The rain continued falling, washing streets clean only for them to become dirty again. In this cycle, Burke found a metaphor for himself. He'd come to Edinburgh seeking honest work, redemption, a better life. Instead, he'd found William Hare, Dr. Knox, and the dark opportunity that would make him infamous. The first chapter had ended. The worst was yet to come. Winter gripped Edinburgh with particular cruelty in early 1828. The cold killed more efficiently than any disease, culling the weak and vulnerable from the city's poorest districts. For most residents of the West Port, this was simply another hardship to endure. For William Burke and William Hare, it was an opportunity. 3 weeks had passed since they'd sold old Donald's body to Dr. Knox. 3 weeks of ordinary poverty, of scraping together rent, of watching their windfall disappear into the bottomless pit of daily expenses. The memory of that easy money haunted both men like a ghost whispering promises. Burke had tried to find legitimate work. He genuinely tried. But each failed job search brought him back to Hare's lodging house, back to conversations that circled around the unspoken like wolves around a campfire. They talked about the weather, about Edinburgh, about nothing important. But underneath every conversation lay the real question: when would they do it again? The answer came in the form of Joseph Miller, though that probably wasn't his real name. He was the kind of man the city produced in abundance, a wanderer, a drinker, someone whose past was deliberately vague and whose future looked non-existent. He'd been staying at Hare's for nearly a week, paying his rent with coins of dubious origin, keeping to himself mostly, coughing occasionally but not sick enough to die on his own anytime soon. That was the problem with waiting for natural death. It was unreliable, unpredictable. Knox wanted fresh bodies regularly. The anatomy season ran from October to May, when cold weather kept corpses from decomposing too quickly. Every week without a delivery was lost income. Burke found himself studying Miller the way a butcher might study cattle. The man was alone, friendless, the type who drifted from city to city leaving no trace. No family had come looking for him. No one asked his surname or his business. He existed in that gray zone of urban anonymity where people could simply disappear. The decision, when it came, felt almost inevitable. Burke and Hare had a whispered conversation in the corner of the lodging house one evening while Margaret served watered-down soup to the residents. It wasn't a long discussion. Neither man wanted to overthink what they were contemplating. They invited Miller to share drinks with them that night. He accepted readily. Free whiskey was not an offer men like Miller refused. They drank in Hare's private room, away from the other lodgers. Burke kept refilling Miller's cup while nursing his own drink. The man's speech grew slurred, his movements uncoordinated. What happened next took less than 10 minutes. Miller, drunk and confused, never understood what was happening. Burke held him down while Hare pressed his hands over the man's mouth and nose. The method was brutally simple. Suffocation left no marks, no obvious signs of violence. To a casual observer, Miller would appear to have died from drink or natural causes. The struggling lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though it felt longer. Miller's eyes went wide with terror and incomprehension. His body fought with the desperate strength of survival instinct. But 2 sober men against 1 drunk was no contest. Eventually, the struggling stopped. The light left Miller's eyes. The thing that had been a person became a commodity. Burke felt physically sick afterward. His hands shook. He'd crossed a line he'd thought himself incapable of crossing. He'd killed a man, not in war, not in self-defense, but for money. For £7 and some shillings. Hare showed less visible distress, though his face had gone pale. Margaret, who'd heard the commotion from the next room, entered and looked at the body with remarkable composure. "Well," she said flatly, "it's done then." They wrapped Miller in the now familiar sack and waited for full darkness. The routine they'd established with Donald served them again. Through the Edinburgh night to Surgeon Square, to Knox's Anatomy Theatre, to the exchange of body for money. Knox examined Miller with the same professional detachment he'd shown before. If he suspected anything, he gave no sign. The body was fresh, very fresh, perfect for dissection. He paid without hesitation and made the same comment about always needing more specimens. Walking back with money in their pockets, Burke and Hare didn't speak. The weight of what they'd done sat between them like a third presence. They'd become murderers. The rationalizations they'd constructed, that they were serving medical science, that they were only hastening inevitable deaths, rang hollow now. But the money was real. £7.10 was more than either could earn in months of honest labor. And Knox's insatiable demand promised steady income if they could stomach the work. The second murder came easier than the first. Not easy. Burke would never call it easy, but easier. A woman named Abigail Simpson, elderly and frail, who'd come to the lodging house seeking shelter. She had a bad cough and rheumy eyes and hands that shook from palsy or drink or both. This time they used the same method but with more efficiency. Less struggle, quicker death. Burke told himself she'd been suffering anyway, that they'd ended her misery. The rationalization helped slightly, though he knew it for the lie it was. Knox paid the same rate. Still no questions. The good doctor's willingness to overlook obvious implications made him complicit in their crimes, though he'd never faced justice for it. A pattern established itself through the winter months. Every 2 or 3 weeks, another victim. They developed criteria for selection, people who wouldn't be missed, who had no family connections, who existed on society's absolute margins. The homeless, the friendless, the forgotten. Hare proved to have a talent for identifying suitable victims. He'd engage them in conversation at pubs, assess their situations, invite them back to the lodging house for cheap accommodation or free drinks. Once there, the outcome was predetermined. Burke handled the actual killing with growing mechanical efficiency. He'd discovered that approaching it as a task, rather than contemplating the humanity of their victims, made it bearable. Don't look in their eyes too long. Don't learn too much about their lives. Don't think about who they'd been before desperation brought them to Edinburgh's slums. Margaret and Helen McDougall, Burke's common-law wife who'd arrived from Ireland in January, became knowing participants. The women didn't do the killing, but they helped lure victims, stood watch, cleaned up afterward. The operation had become a grim family business. The money flowed steadily. Burke bought new clothes, ate in restaurants, drank quality whiskey. The outward signs of prosperity should have brought satisfaction, but they sat uneasily on him. He'd wake at night seeing the faces of the dead, feeling phantom hands struggling against his grip. Hare showed fewer signs of conscience. He spent money freely on drink and gambling, enjoying their newfound wealth without apparent remorse. Sometimes Burke wondered if Hare had always been capable of this, if the poverty had merely suppressed a natural inclination toward violence. By spring, they'd killed 10 people, 10 human beings erased from existence to supply Dr. Knox's Anatomy Theatre. The murders had developed an almost routine quality. Identify victim, lure them in, kill them, deliver the body, collect payment, repeat. But cracks were beginning to show in their system. Other lodgers at Hare's had started noticing patterns. People would arrive, stay briefly, then disappear without collecting their belongings or settling debts. It wasn't normal even for transient populations. A woman named Anne McDougall, no relation to Helen, mentioned to Margaret that she'd seen them carrying suspicious bundles at night. Margaret laughed it off, but the comment rattled them all. They needed to be more careful. Perhaps vary their methods, use different locations, space out the murders more. But Knox's demand was constant, and the money too good to resist. They were caught in a cycle of their own making, needing money to maintain their improved lifestyle, which required more murders, which increased the risk of discovery. Burke suggested they stop for a while, let suspicions die down. Hare argued against it. They had a good thing going. Why quit when they were successful? Besides, they'd crossed the line already. 10 murders or 20, would it make a difference at the gallows? The argument revealed a fundamental difference between them. Burke, despite everything, still felt the weight of their crimes, still struggled with conscience, however weakened. Hare had moved beyond such concerns entirely. He'd become what Burke was terrified of becoming, someone for whom murder was simply business. Their 11th victim was a young man named Daft Jamie, well known in the neighborhood despite his mental disabilities. This was a departure from their usual pattern of selecting anonymous victims. Jamie was recognized, had friends of a sort, would definitely be missed. Burke objected strenuously. Too risky, too visible. But Hare insisted. Jamie had come to the lodging house alone, and Knox paid more for younger, healthier specimens. The financial temptation overrode caution. Jamie's murder haunted Burke more than the others. The young man had been cheerful, trusting, unaware of danger until the final moments. His death felt particularly monstrous because of his vulnerability, his childlike innocence despite his adult body. When they delivered Jamie's body, even Knox seemed momentarily disturbed. He recognized the young man, but the doctor's dedication to anatomical science outweighed his qualms. He paid, though he suggested more discretion in future. The neighborhood noticed Jamie's disappearance immediately. People asked questions. Someone reported seeing him heading toward Hare's lodging house. The casual anonymity that had protected Burke and Hare began to evaporate. They should have stopped then. The warning signs were clear. But the money, the momentum, the numbing of their moral sense, all pushed them forward toward inevitable disaster. By autumn 1828, they'd killed 16 people. 16 souls snuffed out and sold for anatomical study. The precise number would never be definitively established, but 16 was the generally accepted count. Burke had changed fundamentally from the desperate laborer who'd arrived in Edinburgh a year earlier. The poverty remained. Despite their income, both he and Hare spent money as fast as they earned it. But the innocence was gone entirely. He'd become what he'd feared, what he'd never imagined possible. A serial murderer, a monster in human form. Hare remained harder to read, his internal landscape more closed off. But Burke suspected his partner had lost something essential as well. Not conscience, perhaps, but the ability to see other humans as anything but potential commodities. The women, Margaret and Helen, had their own accommodations with evil. They'd chosen complicity, chosen the money, chosen to look away from the humanity of the victims. In some ways, their guilt ran deeper for being more calculated, less direct. Dr. Knox continued his anatomy lectures to packed halls of medical students, his reputation growing with each successful demonstration. The bodies Burke and Hare provided allowed him to offer the most comprehensive anatomical instruction in Britain. His success was built literally on murdered corpses, though he maintained plausible deniability about their origins. The whole arrangement represented a perfect ecosystem of moral corruption. Murderers who needed money, a doctor who needed bodies and asked no questions, a society that valued medical progress over the lives of its poorest members. As October arrived and the new anatomy season began, Burke felt a growing sense of doom. They couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, their luck would run out. Someone would notice, would question, would investigate. But stopping seemed equally impossible. They'd gone too far, killed too many. The weight of 16 murders sat on Burke's soul like stones pulling him toward hell. The rain that had welcomed him to Edinburgh a year earlier still fell with the same cold persistence. But Burke no longer noticed weather. His internal landscape had become so dark that external conditions seemed irrelevant. He'd found what he'd sought in Edinburgh, a way to escape poverty, a means of survival. But the cost had been everything that made survival worthwhile. He'd sold his humanity piece by piece for £7, 10 shillings per transaction. Winter was coming again. The cold that made corpses keep longer, made murder more profitable. Burke knew with terrible certainty that the next victim was already out there somewhere, walking Edinburgh's streets, unaware of their fate. The machine they'd created kept running, fed by greed and desperation, and the terrible momentum of evil unchecked. The descent was complete. What came next could only be the reckoning. Halloween, 1828, arrived cold and wet, the kind of Scottish autumn day that promised winter's approach. In the narrow closes of Edinburgh's West Port, children carved turnip lanterns and told ghost stories, unaware that real monsters walked among them in human form. William Burke woke that morning with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. 16 murders weighed on his conscience like stones, pulling him toward some inevitable reckoning. He dreamed again of faces, all those faces staring at him with accusation and incomprehension. Beside him, Helen stirred but didn't wake. In the gray morning light, Burke studied her face and wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A provider? A protector? Or the monster he'd become? The lodging house was unusually quiet. Most residents had already left to search for work or beg or drink away another day. Only a few remained, including the Greys, James and Anne, a couple who'd been lodging at Hare's for several weeks and had begun asking too many questions. Burke had noticed James Gray watching him with undisguised suspicion. The man had been a policeman before drink cost him his position, and some investigative instinct remained. He'd commented on the disappearances, the strange nocturnal activities, the sudden influxes of money followed by reckless spending. They should have thrown the Greys out weeks ago. But Margaret liked Anne's help around the house, and Hare insisted they needed to appear normal, to avoid drawing attention by suddenly changing their routines. It was a miscalculation that would prove fatal. Burke encountered Mary Docherty by pure chance on Halloween morning. She was perhaps 50, Irish like himself, with the weathered face of someone who'd lived hard and the slight unsteadiness of someone who'd been drinking since breakfast. She stood outside a pub in the Grass Market, trying to sell trinkets from a basket. Broken combs, used ribbons, worthless items scavenged or stolen. Her accent caught Burke's attention immediately. County Donegal, he thought, near his own home region. Burke should have kept walking, should have recognized that Halloween, when the streets were busier, when people paid more attention, was the worst possible time for what he was contemplating. But Hare had been pressuring him for days about another delivery. Knox was asking questions about the drought in supply. Money was running low again, and Mary Docherty was so perfectly vulnerable, alone, drunk, Irish, friendless in a foreign city. Docherty, you say? Burke approached her with a smile he'd practiced into something resembling warmth. That's my mother's maiden name. We might be related. Distant cousins, perhaps. Mary's face lit up with pathetic hope. The prospect of family, of connection, of someone who shared her background in this hostile city. Burke felt a flicker of guilt, quickly suppressed. She followed him with touching trust, chattering about County Donegal, about relatives he'd never heard of, about the poverty that had driven her to Scotland. Burke made appropriate responses while his mind calculated logistics. The lodging house presented a problem. The Greys were there, and their suspicions made them dangerous. Burke couldn't risk them witnessing anything unusual. When they arrived, Hare sized up Mary Docherty immediately. A brief look passed between the partners. Understanding, agreement, conspiracy. Margaret set about preparing the Gray's removal. "Anne," Margaret said sweetly, "would you and James do me a favor? My sister's taken ill across town. Could you stay with her tonight? I'll reduce your rent for the trouble." The request was transparent, but the Grays needed the money. James agreed reluctantly, gathering their few possessions. As they left, he cast one long, suspicious look at Mary Docherty, at Burke and Hare standing too close together, at the general atmosphere of wrongness that pervaded the house. "We'll be back first thing in the morning," James said, and there was a warning in his tone. The door closed behind them, and Mary Docherty's fate was sealed. They gave Mary whiskey. Good whiskey this time, not the usual rot gut. She drank gratefully, talking endlessly about Ireland, about family, about better days. Burke listened and felt something crack inside himself. This woman could have been his mother, his aunt, his sister. She shared his language, his homeland, his culture. In another life, they might actually have been cousins, might have shared meals and stories and genuine kinship. But in this life, she was just another victim. Helen and Margaret joined them, creating a false atmosphere of celebration. Halloween festivities, they said, a party for fellow Irish exiles. Mary relaxed into the warmth and company, so starved for human connection that she ignored every warning sign. By midnight, she was thoroughly drunk, slumped in a chair, singing Irish songs in a slurred voice. The sound grated on Burke's nerves. Too loud, too human, too much a reminder of what they were about to do. Hare made the decision. He nodded to Burke, and they moved with practiced coordination. Mary's eyes widened as Burke grabbed her from behind. For a moment, she looked confused rather than frightened. Surely her cousin wouldn't hurt her. Then Hare's hands covered her mouth and nose, and confusion turned to terror. She fought harder than expected for a drunk woman. Her body bucked and twisted, her hands clawing at Hare's arms. Muffled sounds came from behind his hands, not quite screams, but horrible, desperate noises that would haunt Burke's remaining days. Helen and Margaret watched from the corner, their faces pale but not intervening. They'd become so accustomed to murder that they could witness it without flinching. The struggle lasted perhaps 5 minutes, longer than usual. Mary's survival instinct was strong despite the alcohol, but 2 sober men against 1 drunk woman was no contest. Eventually, the resistance faded. The thrashing became twitching. The muffled sounds stopped. Mary Docherty's body went limp, and the light left her eyes. Burke released his grip and staggered away. 17 murders, 17 souls on his conscience. He waited for the usual numbness to descend, the emotional shutdown that had allowed him to function after the previous killings. It didn't come. Instead, he felt everything: guilt, horror, self-loathing, fear. Looking at Mary's corpse, he saw not a commodity but a person, a woman with a name, a history, people who might miss her. "We need to move her," Hare said, always practical. "Get her to Knox before she stiffens." But it was nearly 1 in the morning, and Halloween had filled the streets with revelers. They couldn't risk carrying a body through crowds. They'd have to wait until dawn, when the city quieted again. They wrapped Mary in a blanket and stuffed her body under the bed in the spare room. The women cleaned up evidence of the struggle while Burke and Hare drank, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. Burke knew something had changed. 17 murders, but this one felt different. This one felt like the end. The Grays returned earlier than expected, shortly after dawn, rather than mid-morning. Margaret's sick sister story had fallen apart when Anne went to check on her and found no illness, no sister, no explanation. James Gray had spent the night thinking about all the strange occurrences at Hare's lodging house, all the disappearances, all the bundles carried at odd hours. His policeman's instinct screamed that something criminal was happening. When they entered the lodging house, The atmosphere was wrong. Burke and Hare looked exhausted and jumpy. Helen and Margaret were aggressively cheerful in a way that suggested covering something up. And the Irish woman from yesterday, Mary Docherty, was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the Irish woman?" James asked directly. "Left early," Hare said too quickly. "Decided to move on." "In the middle of the night? On Halloween?" Irish are a restless people. Hare's smile didn't reach his eyes. Anne Gray noticed something under the bed in the spare room, a straw mattress hastily pulled out of place. While the others were distracted, she bent down to look. A hand. She saw a human hand, cold and waxy, protruding from under a bundle of blankets. Anne's scream brought everyone running. James pushed past Burke and Hare to see what his wife had found. He pulled back the blanket and saw Mary Docherty's face, pale and lifeless, her eyes still slightly open. "Jesus Christ," James whispered. For a moment, everyone froze. Then Hare moved, grabbing James by the arm. "Wait, wait," Hare said urgently. "Let me explain. She died naturally from drink. We were just trying to avoid the expense of burial." "Naturally?" James shook him off. "Her face is bruised. There are marks on her neck." Actually, there weren't. Burke and Hare's method left no obvious signs of violence. But James saw what he expected to see, what made sense of all his suspicions. "Listen," Burke said, his voice desperate. "We can make this worth your while. £10 if you forget what you saw. 20. The offer confirmed James's worst suspicions. He grabbed Anne's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We're going to the police." Hare moved to block their exit, but Margaret stopped him. "Let them go," she said quietly. "It's over." And she was right. In that moment, they all knew it was over. The year of murder, the partnership with Knox, the blood money and false prosperity, all ending with a corpse under a bed and 2 witnesses fleeing to the authorities. Burke sat down heavily on a chair. He felt nothing, not fear, not regret, not anything. Just a vast emptiness, as if the part of him capable of feeling had been murdered along with his 17 victims. "We need to run," Helen said. "Get out of Edinburgh before they come back with police." But where would they go? How far could they get with no money and no plan? And what did it matter anyway? They'd been running from something inevitable since that first murder. Maybe it was time to stop. The police arrived within the hour, a sergeant and 4 constables, grim-faced men who'd heard James Gray's story and came prepared for resistance. They found Burke, Hare, Margaret, and Helen sitting in the common room as if waiting for them. Mary Docherty's body was still under the bed, already beginning to stiffen. The sergeant examined the corpse while his constables kept weapons trained on the 4 suspects. "Anyone want to explain this?" Silence. What explanation was there? "We found her dead," Hare finally said. "She was a lodger. Died in the night. We were going to report it. By hiding the body under a bed, we were uncertain about the proper procedure. It was a pathetic lie, and everyone knew it." The sergeant ordered all 4 arrested on suspicion of murder. As the constables bound their hands, Burke felt an unexpected sense of relief. The waiting was over. The pretense was over. Whatever came next, trial, prison, hanging, it would be an ending. And endings had started to seem preferable to the endless cycle of murder they'd been trapped in. They were taken to the police office on the Royal Mile, processed separately, placed in different cells. Burke sat on the cold stone floor and waited for whatever came next. The investigation moved quickly once it started. James Gray's testimony about the disappeared Irish woman opened a floodgate of suspicions. Other witnesses came forward. Lodgers who'd seen people arrive and never leave. Neighbors who'd noticed strange nocturnal activities. Shopkeepers who'd sold unusual amounts of rope and canvas. The police searched Hare's lodging house thoroughly and found evidence that staggered them. Stains that might be blood, belongings left behind by people who'd vanished, receipts from Dr. Knox's anatomy theater. Knox himself was brought in for questioning. He denied any knowledge of murder, insisted he'd believed the bodies were obtained legally, unclaimed corpses, executed criminals, natural deaths. The doctor's reputation and social standing protected him from immediate arrest, but his career was effectively ended. The police began connecting disappearances to Burke and Hare. Mary Patterson, a beautiful young prostitute whose body had been recognized by medical students at Knox's theater. Daft Jamie, whose disappearance had been widely noted. Others whose names and faces began emerging from the shadows. But proving murder was difficult. Most victims had left no bodies. They'd been dissected and disposed of by Knox. There was no physical evidence beyond Mary Doherty, and even her death could potentially be argued as natural causes or accidental. The authorities needed a confession. They needed someone to turn witness. 5 days after the arrests, William Hare received a visit from the Lord Advocate, the chief prosecutor for Scotland. The offer was simple and brutal. Testify against Burke and receive complete immunity. Refuse and hang beside him. Hare didn't hesitate. Whatever partnership had existed between him and Burke evaporated in the face of the gallows. He agreed to turn King's evidence, to tell everything, to send his former partner to death in exchange for his own life. When Burke learned of the betrayal, he felt something like admiration. Of course Hare had saved himself. It's what Burke would have done if offered the same deal. There was no honor among murderers, no loyalty among men who'd killed for profit. Margaret was also offered immunity in exchange for testimony. She accepted immediately, her practical nature unchanged by circumstances. Helen McDougall would stand trial alongside Burke, but with less evidence against her. She'd been present, had helped lure victims, but hadn't done actual killing. Her fate was uncertain. Only Burke would face the full weight of justice for all 17 murders. In his cell, Burke began to talk, not to the police, not officially, but to the prison chaplain, a kind man named Dr. Marshall who seemed genuinely interested in Burke's soul rather than his crimes. Burke told the story from the beginning. Old Donald's natural death and the decision to sell his body. Joseph Miller and the first murder. The descent into serial killing. The victims, their names, their faces, the way they died. 17 murders in 11 months. Dr. Marshall listened without judgment, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. He was horrified by the details but maintained his pastoral demeanor. "Do you feel remorse?" the chaplain asked. Burke thought about it honestly. Did he? Or was he just sorry he'd been caught? "I don't know," he finally said. "I feel empty, like I murdered my own soul along with theirs. That's closer to remorse than you think." The confession brought some relief, not absolution, but at least honesty. Burke had spent a year lying, rationalizing, pretending to be something he wasn't. Now, facing death, he could finally tell the truth. The trial of William Burke and Helen McDougall began on Christmas Eve, 1828, in Parliament House, Edinburgh's High Court. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see the monsters who terrorized their city. Burke entered in chains, thin and pale from weeks in prison. Helen looked even worse, gaunt, hollow-eyed, broken. They sat together but didn't speak. William Hare took the stand as the prosecution's star witness. He testified for hours, detailing murder after murder in a flat, emotionless voice. He described methods, victims, payments from Knox. He implicated Burke in every killing while minimizing his own role. Always Burke who initiated. Always Burke who did the actual suffocation. It was a performance of self-preservation, technically accurate, but morally dishonest. Hare portrayed himself as a reluctant participant, coerced by Burke's more aggressive personality. The prosecutors allowed this fiction because they needed his testimony. Burke listened to his former partner's lies and felt nothing. Anger would have required energy he didn't possess. Margaret testified next, corroborating Hare's account. She wept on the stand, crocodile tears designed to evoke sympathy. The jury looked unmoved. Medical experts testified about the bodies delivered to Dr. Knox, their freshness, their lack of obvious cause of death. Students recalled seeing Mary Patterson and Daft Jamie on Knox's dissection tables. Knox himself was not called to testify. His involvement was embarrassing to Edinburgh's medical establishment, and powerful people wanted to minimize his public connection to the murders. The defense argued that the prosecution couldn't prove murder, only that bodies had been sold. Without witnesses to the actual killings, without physical evidence, how could they be certain death hadn't been natural? It was a weak argument, and everyone knew it. The sheer volume of circumstantial evidence, combined with Hare's testimony, painted a damning picture. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty. William Burke was guilty of murder. Helen McDougall, not proven. The Scottish verdict that meant neither innocent nor guilty, but insufficient evidence to convict. She was released immediately, though her reputation was destroyed. Burke stood for sentencing without expression. He'd known the outcome before the trial began. "William Burke," the judge said solemnly, "you have been found guilty of murder most foul. You preyed upon the weak and vulnerable of this city, extinguishing lives for profit, showing neither mercy nor remorse. The law demands your life in return." The sentence, death by hanging, followed by public dissection. The irony wasn't lost on Burke. He'd killed to provide bodies for anatomists, and now his own body would serve that same purpose. Poetic justice, some might call it. Burke spent his final month in the condemned cell, a small room with a barred window overlooking Edinburgh Castle. He received visitors, the chaplain daily, Helen once, various officials seeking final confessions. Helen's visit was brief and painful. She looked even worse than during the trial, homeless, shunned, surviving on charity. Burke's conviction had destroyed her by association. "I'm sorry," he told her, and meant it. She nodded, unable to speak, and left quickly. He never saw her again. Burke spent his days writing a full confession, Dr. Marshall's suggestion, put it all down on paper, leave a complete account, unburden the soul before facing judgment. Burke wrote for hours each day, filling page after page with details of his crimes. The confession was detailed and unflinching. He named victims, described methods, explained motivations. He took full responsibility rather than blaming Hare or Knox or poverty or circumstances. These were his murders, his choices, his damnation. At night, he dreamed of the victims. They came to him with silent accusation, their dead eyes staring, their hands reaching. He woke often in darkness, gasping, convinced he could hear their voices. The morning of Burke's execution dawned cold and clear. Outside Liberton's Wynd, where the gallows had been erected, a crowd had been gathering since before dawn. 25,000 people, nearly a quarter of Edinburgh's population, crammed into every available space to witness justice. Burke was led from his cell at 8 in the morning. He'd refused breakfast, claiming no appetite. The chaplain accompanied him, reading psalms, offering comfort that Burke barely heard. The walk to the scaffold took minutes but felt eternal. Burke could hear the crowd outside, not angry shouting, but an anticipatory murmur, like waves against shore. When he emerged into daylight, the crowd erupted. Not cheers exactly, but a roar of satisfaction. The monster would finally pay for his crimes. Burke climbed the scaffold steps with surprising steadiness. He looked out at the sea of faces, rich and poor, young and old, all united in their desire to see him die. The executioner prepared the noose while a magistrate read the formal sentence. Burke barely listened. His mind was elsewhere, back in Ireland, back before Edinburgh, back when he'd been merely poor rather than monstrous. The noose went over his head, rough hemp against his neck. The executioner positioned it carefully. Death should be quick, a broken neck rather than slow strangulation. Burke was asked if he had final words. He shook his head. What was there to say? Sorry seemed inadequate. Explanation seemed pointless. Silence felt most honest. The trap dropped at 8:30 precisely. William Burke fell. The rope snapped taut. His neck broke cleanly. Death was instantaneous, or near enough. His body swung slightly in the cold morning breeze. The crowd roared its approval. Justice was done. Burke's body was cut down after an hour and transported to the anatomy theater of Professor Alexander Monroe, a competitor of Dr. Knox, chosen deliberately to avoid any suggestion of impropriety. The public dissection took place the following day before an audience of medical students and select members of the public. Tickets had been distributed to ensure orderly attendance, though thousands more wanted to witness the spectacle. Professor Monroe dissected Burke methodically, explaining each cut, each organ, each anatomical feature. The irony was pointed. Burke had provided so many bodies for anatomical study. Now he would serve the same purpose. After the dissection, Burke's skeleton was preserved for medical study. His skin was used to make various items: a calling card case, a book binding. These macabre souvenirs would circulate through Edinburgh for decades, physical reminders of the Westport murders. Burke's death mask was made and sold widely. His skull was measured by phrenologists seeking to understand the criminal mind. In death, as in life, he was reduced to commodity. William Hare was released as promised, granted immunity for his testimony. But Edinburgh's citizens hadn't promised anything. Mobs attacked him on the streets, recognizing his face from newspaper illustrations. Hare fled the city within days of his release. Rumors placed him in various locations: Ireland, England, even America. Some said he was thrown into a lime pit by workers who recognized him. Others claimed he lived to old age, blind and begging on London streets. The truth was never established. Hare simply vanished, which perhaps was punishment enough. Margaret Laird, also granted immunity, disappeared with similar completeness. The lodging house was abandoned, its reputation too dark for any tenant. Helen McDougall struggled to survive in Edinburgh after her release. No one would employ her. No landlord would rent to her. She eventually left Scotland, her fate unknown. Dr. Robert Knox faced no criminal charges but suffered complete professional destruction. Students boycotted his lectures. Medical societies expelled him. His anatomy theater closed. He spent his remaining years in London, a brilliant mind ruined by association with murder. He died in obscurity in 1862, never having publicly acknowledged his role in Burke and Hare's crimes. The Westport murders shocked Britain and led directly to legal reform. The Anatomy Act of 1832 allowed medical schools to use unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals, eliminating the market for grave robbing and murder. Burke and Hare's crimes, paradoxically, advanced medical education by forcing honest confrontation with how anatomical specimens were obtained. Edinburgh tried to forget the Westport murders, but couldn't entirely. The crimes had exposed uncomfortable truths about poverty, medical ethics, and societal indifference to the suffering of the marginalized. Burke's confession was published and became a bestseller, feeding public fascination with the macabre. The case inspired plays, books, songs. Burke and Hare became cultural shorthand for murder motivated by profit. The victims were largely forgotten, their names recorded but their lives unremembered. They'd been invisible in life and remained invisible in death, reduced to footnotes in Burke's story. In a small cemetery in Edinburgh, a simple stone marks a mass grave where some of the victims were eventually buried after being recovered from Knox's anatomy theater. The inscription reads simply, "Remember the forgotten." It's the closest thing to justice the victims would ever receive. William Burke entered history as a monster, but he'd started as simply a poor man looking for work, no better or worse than thousands of others. Somewhere between arrival and execution, he'd lost his humanity piece by piece, selling it for money that brought no happiness and security that never arrived. The descent had been gradual but complete, and in the end, he'd paid with everything: his life, his soul, his very body dissected and distributed as specimens and souvenirs. The body snatchers had finally been stopped, but the bodies they'd snatched, 17 lives, 17 souls, could never be returned. Historical note: William Burke was hanged on January 28, 1829, before a crowd estimated at 25,000. His body was publicly dissected by Professor Alexander Monroe, and his skeleton remains on display at Edinburgh Medical School. William Hare disappeared after his release and was never conclusively seen again. Dr. Robert Knox was never charged, but his career was destroyed. The case led directly to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which regulated the supply of cadavers to medical schools and eliminated the market for body snatching. The close where the murders occurred no longer exists, demolished in Edinburgh's later urban development.